welcome from my side to today's webinar. We focus on metastasis. Metastasis is still a great problem in our daily sarcoma care. Whereas with our conventional treatment, we can more or less control a localized disease. We still struggle with metastatic disease, and that's why we need to understand more about the background. And I'm extremely thrilled to have today three speakers focusing on, let's say, three aspects. One aspect is the invisible phase of metastasis. One aspect is the metastasis disease, and then of course polymetastatic disease. And I am very happy that on the one hand, Christoph Klein from Regensburg will talk about the identification and molecular characterization of metastasis founder cells. Then David Palma from London, Ontario, about beyond numbers, the clinical implications of oligometastatic disease. Christoph Booth then from Kingston, Ontario, about the common sense oncology, moving back to outcomes that matter. So what we hope to learn today is to understand the spectrum of metastatic disease from its dormant stages to visible manifestations, to gain a comprehensive understanding of the biology behind metastasis development, and emphasizing the significance of early detection and intervention, to recognize the importance of tumor load in determining treatment strategies and its implications in systemic therapy, and of course to challenge conventional treatment paradigms and advocate for a more patient-centered approach to oncology. Having said all this, I'm thrilled to hand over to Christoph Klein. We need to know Christoph Klein belongs to the most cited researchers on dormant disease, and I'm really happy that you take your time and to be with us. Please.
So thank you very much for this very, very kind introduction and the invitation. Before I start, I would just like to point out to everybody that I'm not a sarcoma researcher. I'm coming from the field of epithelial cancers, like breast cancer, prostate cancer, and these things. And it was actually quite interesting to me to learn when I started to prepare this presentation that there may be links that could be of interest to you. And I therefore changed a little bit the direction of the talk, and then I'm showing today only unpublished data, very, very recent research, because I'd be happy to discuss this a little bit with you. So the field of research we are in dates back about 35 years ago, and it was the great idea of Gerd Riedmüller, an immunologist. I try to get a pointer, sorry. I get the pointer. Sorry, I can't get the pointer. Gerd Riedmüller was the first who had the idea to look in mesenchymal organs like blood, bone marrow, lymph nodes for disseminated epithelial cells. And as a marker, he used histogenetic proteins like cytokeratins, antibodies against cytokeratins, and another molecule at that time called 17-1A, which today is EpCAM. And he noted that in patients without metastasis, he can detect positive cells, cytokeratin positive or EpCAM positive cells, years before the emergence of metastasis. There have been, and I will show this later, many clinical studies on that. But before I do this, I just was surprised, and I want to find these papers that I just found where EpCAM now is being used also in sarcomas, even in context of very classical and gold standard assays like the cell search assay to detect circulating sarcoma cells and or disseminated sarcoma cells in bone marrow. Circulating, I call them when they are in the blood, disseminated when they are in organs. And so that these markers may indeed have role also in sarcoma research. And therefore, maybe what we have been doing in epithelial cancer may be actually quite interesting also for you. So outcome in these papers has been found to be expressed by a variety of sarcomas. The expression of these markers correlates with aggressiveness, and they can be detected in circulating sarcoma cells and in disseminated sarcoma cells. And as I said, they can be used in combination with the standard assays. So what have we been doing in epithelial cancers? Since the cells are super rare, we have been developing technologies to isolate these cells after staining, immunocytochemistry, immunofluorescence. They are very rare, 1 in a million, 2 in a million, and we isolate them by micromanipulation. And then we have established a variety of technologies to investigate them, to describe them, and to functionally explore them. The important thing for you to know is this is some tedious work, because the cells are so rare that you not even can use nowadays actual genomics technologies, which need at least a few hundred of disseminated cancer cells in 10,000. So here, this is still very high workload to isolate and find these disseminated cancer cells. Now, what we found in the past years, and I just summarized the last 25 years for you. So we developed single-cell technologies so that we can analyze them. We found that these cells disseminate very early in genomic time. That is, they do not have all the mutations that the primary tumor has, probably because they somehow got arrested in the organ and did not develop and acquire the same mutations. At least they spread earlier. We found that in animal models, many of the metastases are derived from these early disseminated cells, not from the late cells, that disseminated cancer cells acquire genetic alterations once they arrive at the site of metastasis. And so the big question for us was, can we get a better picture, better understanding how these cells are actually related to metastases that develop in patients? And in order to address this, we teamed up with 2 scientists from the Weizmann Institute, a computational scientist, to do a very crazy experiment. And this experiment was the following. So we isolate these rare cells from the bone marrow. We do a whole genome amplification of the cells, and then we use information that is usually not selected, which is microsatellite sequencing. That is the sequences in the genome that are used for example, paternity testing or in forensic medicine, to eventually establish a cell lineage tree. So unlike in the paternity testing, it's not enough to check 9 to 11 microsatellite markers, which will tell whether the child is from a specific father or not. But in that case, we needed about 12,000 microsatellites. So we did this single-cell sequencing, and we isolated, and I will give you one example of a patient, single cells from the primary tumor. We isolated cells when the patient had no metastasis yet in the M0 stage from bone marrow. At the same time, when the primary tumor was operated, we used T cells and macrophages as controls, as reference. And then 7 years after surgery, initial surgery, the patient developed metastasis. And we took circulating tumor cells as representative cells for metastasis. And the question that we had was, is the standard classical model correct that assumes that the metastasis is derived from the most advanced cell of the primary tumor, or does somehow metastasis develop in parallel to the primary tumor clones in a different scenario? And so this is just the clinical wrap-up of the patient. You see the bone marrow was taken in 2009 when the surgery was performed. And then the patient had here the classical follow-up, and in 2016, metastases were diagnosed. So we took all these cells, did the 12K sequencing of the microsatellite, and the colleagues from the Weizmann Institute then generated a cell lineage tree. And this is what I would like to show you. The first thing what you see here, these are the cells that we isolated from the primary tumor. Next to it, we find the cells that were isolated 7 years later from the blood. And what you can already see, there is a clear split between here and there. Then we have here normal epithelial cells, which were taken as reference from the normal breast or from the oral cavity as a swab. And then here we have hematopoietic cells. So we already get here a split between epithelial cells, we get a split between hematopoietic and epithelial cells, and we get a split between metastatic cells and the primary tumor cells. And now the question was, where are the disseminated cancer cells that we isolated from bone marrow? And interestingly, we found one cell that is clustering here with the metastatic cells, and another one that's clustering here almost close to the root of the tree. Very, very normal appearing. And then another interesting thing was we could also detect circulating tumor cells at the time point of metastatic disease, which were clustering here with the normal cells. Now, very strange, we checked, of course, then, whether these cells are cancer cells. And these are profiles which depict the chromosomal gains and losses over the complete genome. So here's chromosome 1, 2, 3, etc. And when you have something like this here, you have a gain of a chromosome. And very interesting, all the cells that were outside the primary tumor had a gain of chromosome 12. And the cells from the primary tumor had either a loss or a normal chromosome 12. So we can not only confirm that the disseminated cancer cells from bone marrow are cancer cells, or that the circulating tumor cells from the metastatic patients are cancer cells, although they cluster microsatellite-wise with the normal cells. And this indicates that they indicate several things, which I summarize here. So the first finding was that the primary tumor and the metastasis can develop in parallel. There is no linear descent. The second finding was that in bone marrow, we can detect cells 7 years before the metastasis emerges, which are closely related to the metastatic cells that appear 7 years later. We can also see that in the bone marrow, we can find cells that represent very, very early stages of the primary tumor. In fact, you could think of studying tumorigenesis maybe better in the bone marrow than in the primary tumor, because the cells have been replaced in the primary tumor, overgrown, you can't find them anymore, but somehow they are preserved in the bone marrow. Then we can also see metastatic cells isolated from the blood at the time point of metastasis, which represent equally these very early evolutionary stages. This could indicate that we have indeed now evidence for tumor dormancy, because the further left in the tree, further up the cell is positioned, the fewer cell divisions the cell has taken. So that was all interesting. And now the question, of course, for us was, what's the clinical impact for disease progression? And now this is what I mentioned in the beginning. This is what has been done for many, many years since 1987, that people have collected clinical data, have stained the bone marrow, have checked whether the finding of a cytokeratin positive cells in the bone marrow is predictive of outcome. And yes, it is, but you are clinicians, you know that this is a bit disappointing. This is not dramatic. The patients, it's highly significant, but the impact here is not really so strong. The question is, do we detect the right cells? So it's evident. Just counting the cells is certainly not enough. However, the assay could help to detect the metastatic seed long before the formation of metastasis. And if we succeed to better analyze these cells, then this could be, in fact, quite interesting. So that's what we did. We isolated these cells, now not dead cells for cytokeratin. Cytokeratin is an intracellular marker. The cells are dead. We can look at DNA. But now we use EpCAM, and that's the other marker, which is a surface marker, and we can isolate living cells. We can isolate cells where we can check the RNA, the gene expression of the cells. And this was, as I said, quite a tedious work, and many MD and PhD students spent many, many hours over many years to eventually collect significant numbers of EpCAM positive cells from 3 cancer types. I'm showing breast, lung cancer, and prostate cancer data. So what did we find? First, some hints why this was not so super easy. EpCAM is a marker which is good in bone marrow if the cells express the molecule. We can detect it by staining, but the problem is it's not entirely specific. We can, in every bone marrow, we can detect a handful of bright shining cells, which are really annoying. You may have the impression that here the cells are a little bit weaker than here from a patient without metastasis. But these cells are also weaker than the small clusters that we find, for example, when the patient has metastatic disease. So I will talk for the rest of my talk. I will use the following nomenclature. I will talk about M0 DCCs, which are single disseminated cancer cells from a patient that does not have metastasis, and M1 DCCs when the patient is presenting with metastasis. Not necessarily bone metastasis, it can be anywhere, in the lung, in the brain, whatever. We see a higher number of cells in the bone marrow when a patient has metastasis. The cells that we isolated had white EpCAM staining, and however, we still, later talk, differentiate 2 groups, EpCAM high and EpCAM low. The difference is not the staining. The difference is whether or not in the single cell we have a high transcript abundance or not. Now, it took us so long because we couldn't make sense with the data, and you will later see why this was difficult. For us, it was a great breakthrough when this paper was published. This is a paper where data were generated from 100,000 single bone marrow cells from 8 donors with different technology than ours, but the result was single cell RNA sequencing. And they generated basically, they identified 27 to 35 different cell populations in the bone marrow. This is normal bone marrow. This is healthy bone marrow. And so what we did was we used our data of the single cells that we isolated from the patient to map them in here to check whether we have cancer cells, then they should be different. or whether we had isolated just the normal bone marrow cell population. And this is how it looks like. So the control cells, they were going, and we knew these are plasma cells, and they were perfectly matching with the plasma cells of the bone marrow atlas. This bone marrow atlas, projection into the bone marrow atlas of the plasma cells into plasma cells was our positive control, so that the bioinformatic method was actually working. Here we have the cluster of the M0 cells, and here we have the cluster of the M1 cells. I show this a little bit in more detail. Here are the plasma cells, they match. Interestingly, the M1 cells, they cluster together with rare stroma cells, probably because of this process of mesenchyma, epithelial mesenchymal transition. Here, and that was the most relieving finding for us, most of our EpCAM positive cells did not cluster within the bone marrow atlas cells, but they formed a new continent in this atlas. And then we had an unclear, some cells which were not clearly identified. When we take the cells that we had isolated, not the cells from this other paper, we come up with these groups: M1 DCC, the plasma cells, and the EpCAM cells, which come in 3 flavors: EpCAM high, EpCAM low, and unclear cells. So in the next step, we want to prove that we have cancer cells. And for that, we can try to infer gains and losses of chromosomes, copy number variation. CNV stands for copy number variation of the bone marrow cells. As a reference, you see here the plasma cells, and you see just a little bit of noise here. When we take the M1 cells, you can see clear losses or gains in several regions. So this is how it looks when you have copy number changes in the cells. If we take the EpCAM high cells, you see the same. So strong enrichment or losses of inferred copy number changes. So these cells are likely disseminated cancer cells. Then we looked at the EpCAM low cells, and here the picture is much less clear. It looks like a little bit like the plasma cells, not very convincing, no final proof that we do have cancer cells here. This could also be some normal cells here. And then, quite interestingly, this unclear group looked like this. Obviously, it was a mixed cluster with cells that clearly have copy number alterations and other cells that do not have copy number alterations. And so we do think in this cluster there are additional cancer cells. Now, if we zoom into this cluster, it's also interesting to find that the normal cells, they also sort of cluster together, and those with the copy number variations, they form a cluster within the cluster. So again, separating candidate cancer cells from normal cells without chromosomal changes. Now, when we look how these 3 groups of disseminated cancer cells, EpCAM high, EpCAM low, and from this mixed cluster, how they are distributed, it was quite interesting to learn that these cells here with these later changes are all from the mixed cluster, all derived from prostate cancer. They are different. The EpCAM high cells we find in all groups, but in lung cancer we find only those. In breast cancer we find EpCAM low, like in prostate cancer, and only a single of these cells, which I call M0P, just because they are from prostate cancer. And interestingly, again, the cells with the operations are clustering here next to the bone marrow atlas. So that was all nice. I didn't show you all the data, but supportive for the fact, for the assumption that we isolated disseminated cancer cells was they cluster different from the normal bone marrow cells. I didn't show you that we tested also for mutations with the primary tumor, and we find mutations that are shared between primary tumors and these cells. And we found evidence for copy number variation in 2 of the 3 groups. But still, there was something puzzling, and this is what I also want to show you. So when we take the cells, when the patient has metastasis, and we have the 3 cancer types, we can, just by unsupervised clustering of the expressed genes, we can clearly separate the different cancer types. So it's no problem to tell, here is breast cancer, here is lung cancer, here is prostate cancer cells. When we do this with the cells we isolated at earlier time points, before metastasis is diagnosed, we can't do this anymore. It's a complete mix. And this went together with one strange finding that we had made before, that these cells have strongly activated gene expression. And that was interesting because of this paper here. In that paper, they took data from the mouse and they checked the stemness, which is the potency, totipotent, pluripotent, multipotent, and differentiated cells. And they had a very interesting observation. The more genes are expressed within a single cell, the higher the potency, the higher the stemness. And as the cells differentiate, they specialize. They express fewer genes, genes that are not in networks so much. And this was going together with our findings that we find many cells which have very high gene expression. We translated this then later. We checked, we then wanted to find out the phenotypes of these cells, and we compared the gene expression enrichment, and we compared the M0 and the M1 cells. For the M1 cells, we find typical pathways activated, like ductal cells, epithelial cells, all what you would expect. Also, epithelial mesenchymal transition. However, when we looked into the M0 cells, we find terms like stem cell, embryonic, placenta, pluripotent stem cell. All these pathways incredibly enriched with high Q and P values. So translating this into a score, we see that effectively the cells that we isolate from the bone marrow, they are very stemish. For example, in comparison to the metastatic cells. And that may be the reason why they have forgotten their histogenetic origin. However, when we now check the 3 groups that we have isolated, for the M0P, again, we find all these stem cell terms. In the EPCAM high, we also find the stem cell terms, but now in the internal comparison, now the terms pop up again: lung, basal, memory, prostate. So we find some traces of histogenetic origin also in these cells, but not in the EPCAM low cells. These are the cells that we least understand at the moment. And I wasn't sure if I have enough time. The last piece of information I did not include, but just for your information, cells with a high stemness score predict really poor outcome in these patients, for the patients where we now have the follow-up period. So I just would like to sum up. We found in these studies that the dissemination is very early, that the cells before metastasis, before they start to form a metastasis, are probably in an embryonic phenotype. I didn't show you this, but when they go into lymph nodes, the microenvironmental signal, we can identify that it is the microenvironmental signal that induces stemness, and then the cells react and start to suppress the immune system. And then in a later step, they start to further differentiate and become more similar to the histogenetic origin they have. So what could be the relevance for sarcoma researchers to finish this? So EpCAM, in fact, may actually be also suited, at least it's an interesting thought for me, to detect these metastasis founder cells in sarcoma, maybe in bone marrow. Then, of course, this is more difficult in the sarcoma field because the expression of EpCAM will be lower in sarcoma, and these papers have shown this. EpCAM is expressed, but not at levels that you have in epithelial cancers. And then, of course, it would be quite an attractive concept to challenge whether actually the microenvironment impacts on the cells to form their, to change them and use the plasticity. And maybe there is some shared features between carcinomas and sarcomas. And with that, I would like to end and thank all my collaborators, many clinicians for the different types of cancers, and our pathologists who help us to get access to the samples. So thank you very much for your attention, and if you have questions, I'd be happy to discuss it.
Well, thanks so much. Indeed, you have to be commended for this great summary and to make it somewhat digestible for the clinician. That's very helpful. I don't see question in the chat, but maybe one question before we go on is, what about the temporal relation? I mean, is it, when can we detect so-called metastatic cells in relation to the primary tumor first? Is there anything known in that respect?
Well, most of our samples we get at the time point of surgery. So when a breast or prostate cancer patient is undergoing curative surgery, the bone marrow sample is taken in anesthesia, or the lymph node sample is taken. And at that time point, often many years before metastasis is then diagnosed, we can detect these cells in the bone marrow. Whether one could detect these cells even earlier than even before the primary tumor is detected, we have not been studying. But in theory, I would think that should be possible.
From your perspective, is it more likely to be clinically used from the diagnostic standpoint or therapeutic, or both? What are your expectations?
So our line of research certainly is, if it's true that we now have identified metastasis founder cells, and I'm really sorry that I didn't put the follow-up data, because we stained a couple of patients with these stemness markers, and the impact on the survival is dramatic. So if these are metastasis founder cells, of course they are targets of adjuvant therapies. And now the profiling, this is a new phenotype. This is not like the cell line you have in culture. This is not like the metastatic cell that you usually operate on. The cells look different. They look embryonic. And to understand that and use this as to use it to identify therapeutic targets, it's for us now extremely exciting. And maybe something similar is also possible in sarcomas. I haven't seen these papers, and I think that could be worth of doing some research for the younger the audience here.
Yeah, no, I cannot thank you enough. I mean, you bring our understanding to a whole different level. First, and second, you give us even a direction. I mean, that's really intriguing. I really thank you for your contributions. For the sake of time, I think we move on. Now, the more interesting it will be what David Palma will talk to us. Again, beyond the numbers, clinical implications. We are really looking forward. Please, David.
Thank you. It's really nice to see everybody virtually. I really enjoyed that first talk. My talk is going to be a clinical talk, and I think one thing in the back of my head is how do we bridge the gaps between this cutting edge basic science and then where we are clinically, because we do lag behind for sure. So I'm going to talk about the clinical implications of oligometastatic disease, a little bit beyond the numbers. These are my disclosures. None of them are relevant to the talk here. It's always nicer to meet in person, and although we can't meet in person for everything, it's always good just to see a background of where everybody's from. So many of you, it's evening over here in Europe. Here in Canada, where I am in London, Canada, it's just the morning. Dr. Booth is actually not that far from me. He's in a beautiful city just to the east of me. Hopefully we'll get to see many of you in person at some point. I live in a city called London, Canada, which is called the Forest City. And our hospital is a tertiary care center. We're a fairly big oncologic center for North America. We have about 20 medical oncologists, 20 radiation oncologists. We serve an area of about 1.5 million people. So in today's talk, I'm going to start with some history. It's good to see where we've come from. So I'm going to do a brief history of oligometastases, and then I'm going to come right to the present time and give you a summary of evidence from randomized trials. Unfortunately, I think across all the randomized trials in oligometastases, I think there are only 2 sarcoma patients on those trials. Then I'm going to look at some practical questions. Can we define oligometastatic? Is it 1 to 3? Is it 1 to 5? Who has a good prognosis? If we're going to treat oligometastases, which lesions should we treat? And then we're going to go beyond the numbers, and I'm going to look ahead to the future a little bit. I feel as though in oncology, we are at a crossroads where we have a lot of treatments available to us, but don't yet have strong evidence for many of those treatments, including in surgery and in radiation oncology. And so it's hard to say where our specialties are going to be going in the next decade. Is it going to be the path here? Is it going to be the path here? And if any of you have ever been lost in the past, not knowing which direction to choose, your first instinct when you're lost is to turn around and look behind you to see where you came from. So where did we come from when it comes to oligometastases? Even though we like to think we're very new and cutting edge, this is a very old idea, not with the term oligometastases, but the idea that some patients with limited metastases can be cured. This is a case report from 1939 in the Journal of Urology, written by 2 surgeons, Dr. Barney and Dr. Churchill from Massachusetts General Hospital. And they report a case of a 55-year-old woman with a primary renal adenocarcinoma and lung metastasis. This is the first report I've ever seen of somebody treating oligometastases curatively. So they were treated with a nephrectomy and then radiation to the lung metastasis. For radiation oncologists in the crowd, the radiation dose was very low, the equivalent of 8 gray in 11 fractions. Some of you will know that we currently give 8 gray in 1 fraction just to palliate painful symptoms. So this is almost a homeopathic dose of radiation, but the technology back then was very rudimentary. So the lesion in the lung grew, the patient had a partial lobectomy, and the patient ultimately died of other causes more than 2 decades later. So it's interesting to read the summary from this case report, especially now that we're in evidence-based medicine and we're relying on RCTs to make recommendations for care. Here are some conclusions just from a single case. And the 2 conclusions are that a lung metastasis from adenocarcinoma of the kidney is not radiosensitive. And the second conclusion is that if a metastasis is apparently solitary and accessible to surgical removal, it is definitely worthwhile to undertake removal of the metastasis as well as the primary growth. So a very high level of certainty in their writing, despite the fact that it was only a case report. The paradigm of oligometastasis and the term itself was coined in this editorial in JCO by Hellman and Wexelbaum. And they are talking in this editorial about cancer as a spectrum. And they're actually referring to breast cancer, but it might apply to many cancers. And with any spectrum, there are there are lateral extents. There are polarized points on the spectrum. At one point on the spectrum, a disease is localized for a long time. At the far end, it's systemic very early on. But because it's a spectrum, there are intermediate states. And one of these states is the oligometastatic state, which the theory postulates that some patients should be amenable to a curative treatment strategy. So many times these talks around oligometastases are looking at retrospective data. And the problem with retrospective data on oligometastases is that it can be highly biased by selection bias, by immortal time bias, and a few other factors. And so I'm going to go right to the RCTs, because now across all different histologies in cancer, we have a large number of completed randomized trials, most of them phase 2, to be honest. Only one phase 3, but I'm going to show you on the first slide the trials that show benefit for ablative treatments in the setting of oligometastatic disease. I know this is a sarcoma meeting. I'll come to sarcoma in a few minutes. Here are the histologies in the positive trials. So there are 4 trials in non-small cell lung cancer, 3 in prostate, 2 in colorectal, and 2 with multiple histologies. And as far as I know, those 2 sarcoma patients that have been accrued across all these trials were the ones on the Sabre Comet trial, which we ran out of my center. The trial names are down in the second column, and then the intervention in the third column, radiation, surgery, or stereotactic ablative radiotherapy. One trial used radiofrequency ablation, and the benefits that were shown, whether they were OS, which we'll hear in the next talk is probably the most important endpoint, along with quality of life, and then progression-free survival, which is of perhaps less use, but still informative. The main takeaway from this is that we have a large number of positive trials. There are now 10 here that are positive. The second takeaway is that across all these trials, the vast majority of patients were treated with Sabre. We have 7 Sabre trials. We have 2 that allowed radiation or surgery, but on these 2 trials, most patients had radiation. So the vast majority of patients treated on the RCTs that have shown benefit have been treated with Sabre. And then the third takeaway is that sometimes we have quite important endpoints that have been demonstrated, including overall survival, although most of these in a phase 2 type of design, only one in a phase 3. There are 2 negative trials, and I'm not going to go into the trials in detail because of time and because they're not sarcoma trials. I just want to put it out there that this is not universal, and there may be some histological specific differences in the potential benefits. The first trial was for resection of colorectal metastases to the lungs. It only accrued about 90 patients out of the several hundred in the sample size and did not show a benefit, although the hazard ratio was less than 1, but we can't make any conclusions. This trial, the BR002 trial for breast cancer, was negative after about 3.5 years of follow-up, and it may suggest that breast cancer patients have a different biology. It may suggest that we need longer follow-up. I'm going to come to sarcoma in a minute, but I'm just going to show you how long-term follow-up is important. This is the Sabre Comet trial, which is a trial that we ran, and these are the overall survival results beyond 5 years after study closure. For those of you not familiar with the trial, it was for patients with 1 to 5 metastatic lesions from a solid tumor histology, and the primary tumor had to be controlled before randomization. And they were randomized in a 1-to-2 ratio between standard of care palliative treatments or the addition of stereotactic radiation. This was a phase 2 trial, highly significant p-value though, and the 8-year overall survival was about doubled with the use of Sabre. When you look at the median overall survival, in the control arm, it was 28 months, and in the Sabre arm, we saw 25 months more of median overall survival. And interestingly, when we first reported the trial, this improvement was only 13 months. So as follow-up has become longer, the magnitude of benefit has become more. There were some downsides of the Sabre Comet trial, only 99 patients, and also there were a lot more prostate patients in this arm than you would expect with a 2-to-1 randomization. And so we did, as a exploratory analysis, we just looked at outcomes by histology just to see what the hazard ratios were showing us. Although the numbers are small, the confidence intervals are wide, and this is completely exploratory. But it's useful to see in the different histologies. We have breast, colorectal, lung, prostate, and other, which would include the few sarcoma patients. And then we have the non-prostate primaries. Because of this imbalance in the prostate patients, we just did an exploratory analysis to see what would happen if you took them out of the trial. And what we're seeing is that most of the hazard ratios are favorable. This is not meant to be practice changing, but just to give you an idea. Lung was not favorable, but this effect that we're seeing of SABR seems to be across most of the histologies. And even excluding that prostate imbalance, we would have still had a positive trial with the phase 2 design that we had. Now, what about sarcoma? Well, it's unfortunate, but we do not have any randomized evidence for sarcoma. And one reason why we include multiple histologies on our trials that we've been running is that it really helps with successful accrual. The trials that have been limited to one histology, even the big ones like breast, prostate, lung, have accrued extremely slowly. And so our approach has been to do multiple histology trials to try to establish the overall premise, and then specific histology trials can look at outcomes in a smaller group, maybe using PFS as a surrogate. But if you want to look at the evidence specific for sarcoma, I'd refer you to this ASCO educational book from 2018, which is a really good review of the multidisciplinary management of oligometastatic soft tissue sarcoma. And I just want to give you 2 quotes. One, they say, importantly, if a patient sustains a good response to chemotherapy resulting in true oligometastatic disease, consideration of multimodality local therapy approaches can be considered in the appropriate patient. So you can think about it, whether or not you want to do it, the evidence isn't very strong. I strongly agree with this statement, and I'll give you some data on this in a second. It is felt unlikely that these procedures will render a patient to be long-term disease-free, to a long-term disease-free status. So I'm going to go through some practical questions for us now. The first question is this: can we define oligometastatic? There's a rule in journalism called Betteridge's law, and it says that any headline that ends in a question can be answered with the word no. So I'll give you an example of that. This is from the National Geographic. Was Darwin wrong? The answer is no. Can we define oligometastatic? The answer is no. Some people have suggested that we use a number like 1 to 3 or 1 to 5. Those are the most common, but this isn't really evidence-based. What you could do is look at the randomized trials to see who is included and use that to define oligometastatic. And in sarcoma, we have no randomized trials, so we've got nothing there. But even in lung, where we have 4 RCTs, just looking at 3 of them, you can see the inclusion criteria differ in terms of what the population is. These were EGFR mutated. Did they require systemic therapy? Do they allow the primary tumor to be there? How do they count lymph nodes? It varies. How do they define oligometastatic? Up to 3, up to 6, up to 5. So we can't rely on the data yet to give us a true definition. And I'm going to try to convince you that we'll actually never have a true definition of oligometastatic, and I'll tell you why. There are 2 ways that you could define oligometastatic depending on the implications of the word. You could say that somebody has oligometastatic disease because that disease is curable. You could say 1 to 3 might be curable, and that's how we're going to define it. So we'll say cancers are oligometastatic when there's a chance of cure. The problem with this definition is that we don't have a definition of cure for many cancers. When is the sarcoma patient cured? Maybe 5 years. What about breast? Is it 10? Is it 20? We don't really know. And even if we could define cure, it's unlikely to be a hard cutoff at 3. It's likely a decreasing probability as the number of Mets increase. So I don't think we'll have a definition of oligometastatic based on chance of cure. The other approach you could take is to say that cancers are oligometastatic when patients benefit from ablative treatment. We might not be able to cure you, but we can extend your overall survival by 3 months, 6 months, and those are the patients in whom we will define oligometastatic disease. The problem, as I'll show you in a second, is we are pushing the boundaries from 1 to 3, 1 to 5, 1 to 10, even higher, and we could be in a scenario where patients have 15 lesions and they're benefiting, and that is clearly not oligo. So I don't think we'll ever have a definition of oligometastatic that is immune to any criticism. We might be able to have some pragmatic definitions, but there will never be a perfect definition. Who has a good prognosis? I like to use this term, the 4 aces. For those of you who like to play poker, this is a very good hand. And we know across many trials, this is a simplification, but it works very well, that these 4 factors are very good at predicting, at giving us a prognosis. Those include patients who are young, those who are fit, those with a slow-growing cancer, and a low disease burden. And when you look across multiple studies, there are examples of this: young age, often less than 65 or 70, patient fitness with a good performance status, slow-growing cancers, often that means a metachronous presentation of your Mets, and then a minimal disease burden. Fewer metastatic sites is better than more. We've refined this more, and this is a review article in JCO that we put together, and feel free to have a look. We've refined this more into 3 groups: best candidates, less favorable candidates, and unfavorable candidates, based on patient selection, toxicity risk, and timing. But this is most about, these are prognostic and not predictive factors. And we don't know for sure that these patients would benefit and these would not. But there are some things to consider here in choosing your patients. It's also important to know, and I have this in my consent discussion, and this comes back to that sarcoma paper where they said long-term cure is unlikely. We also see that with SABR, we see that with any modality. These are the PFS curves from SABR Comet, and I show them to you to show that in a short period of time, many patients will progress, and by 5 years, almost everybody will progress. We had about 20% alive and free of progression. So progression can happen quickly. Most people recur, but some who recur can be salvaged with repeat ablative treatments. And sometimes it is curative, even though usually it's not. This is a patient, and I wanted to just show a radiation plan for the non-radiation oncologist. Down here, you have an adrenal lesion in gray, which is not outlined. And these are the dose lines from my radiation plan. And there's a high dose more posteriorly. These red lines here show a dose of 60 gray. And as you come forward, it's a lower and lower dose to keep the dose to the stomach within tolerance. And this was the patient when he was discharged after 10 years. This was a MET from colorectal cancer. I know it's an anecdote. Who wants to see anecdotes? That's not a high level of evidence. But this is actually the first patient on the SABR Comet trial, which I think gives a person a story behind a Kaplan-Meier curve. We also know that serious adverse events are very unlikely, actually both with surgery and stereotactic radiation. In this review in JAMA Oncology, the grade 3 to 5 AE rate from SABR is estimated at only 1.2%, and the late 3 to 5 toxicity rate is about the same. There are not too many treatments in oncology with a grade 3 to 5 toxicity rate in the 1% area. A few other points before I close. If you do choose to treat, the evidence supports treating all lesions wherever possible, not leaving some lesions behind. I'm going to show you some data from a prostate trial. This trial looked at PFS comparing 2 groups of patients. They were randomized, one group of patients randomized to 2 arms. So it was people with recurrent prostate cancer based on PSA relapse and imaging findings. They were randomized to SABR or observation and then initiation of ADT when needed. And they just gave the SABR based on the lesions they saw on CT, and they saw a PFS benefit. But the patients in the SABR arm at enrollment also had a more sensitive scan called a PSMA PET. This wasn't used for radiation planning. It was just used as research purposes. And they looked back to see which patients had untreated lesions and which did not. And the ones, even if they had SABR to everything you could see on CT, if you left some lesions untreated, then the PFS was terrible, almost the same as just observation. And even distant metastases, if you left some lesions untreated, the rate of distant metastases was higher, which tells us, we know this from other studies, including phylogenetic studies of cancer, that metastases can seed other mets. So don't leave anything behind. For the radiation oncologist, I'm just going to skip this quickly because I want to leave enough time for Dr. Booth. Don't go chasing the abscopal effect. This RCT shows that this might not be the case. And then finally, I'm going to say that the best systemic therapy timing is unknown. If a patient is on systemic therapy, this EORTC paper has some guidelines on when to stop the systemic therapy based on the type of drug, but there's not a lot of evidence here. We tend to stop targeted agents for 2 days, cytotoxic agents for 5 days, but there's no consensus. But if they have good systemic therapy available, systemic therapy can help. This is from a cohort study looking at overall survival if you can give people upfront systemic therapy after SABR. So my last slide, we do have phase 3 data coming. If you look at number of metastases, 1, 4, and 10, if the primary is controlled, SABR Comet 3 should complete accrual next year, 300 plus patients, primary endpoint overall survival. SABR Comet 10 is about 2 months from completing accrual, 4 to 10 metastases, primary endpoint overall survival. For more than 10 metastases, we have the ARREST 2 trial, primary endpoint overall survival. And in this space, we have SABR Sync, again, primary endpoint overall survival. So I'll close by saying that some patients with oligomets can be cured. SABR has a lot of supporting randomized evidence, but not a lot of phase 3 trials. We know which patients have the best prognosis, but there's still substantial uncertainty around what to treat, what doses to use, but we can still make reasonable decisions, and phase 3 trials are coming. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for this comprehensive dissection of oligometastatic disease. As usual, it's always more complicated than we might hope, but of course, extremely helpful. And I think, yeah, we have to discuss this also with a radiation oncologist. But for the sake of time, I suggest that we take it together discussion and go directly over to Christopher Booth for your common sense oncology presentation, please.
Great, thanks, Bruno. So I'm going to talk about something quite different, and so I think the 3 talks complement each other. I'm just going to. Great. So I'm a medical oncologist and health services researcher in Canada, just a few hours down the road from Dr. Palma, who, as famous as he's become, I always tell everyone he started his career here at Queen's University in Kingston, so we get to claim a little bit of his success. I have no relationships with the pharmaceutical industry. So I'm going to, in the next 15 or 20 minutes, be fairly critical of our field, but I'm also going to offer what we see as some solutions. And before I get critical, I want to pause and remember why all of us as clinicians, scientists, and investigators do the work we do. And that's because of the patients and the families that have cancer and walk that journey. And so I conceptualize the art of cancer care as delivering compassion, reducing suffering, and offering treatments, but treatments that make a difference. And while some of our treatments provide large benefits for patients, I think there's reasons to be concerned that in recent years, many new treatments offer very small and perhaps no real benefits. I'm going to share a paradox here just to kind of set the stage. I call this the cancer medicine paradox. And we live in a world right now where, on the one hand, there is substantial overutilization of marginal, toxic, and expensive medicines, especially near the end of life. However, at the same time, due to problems with access and affordability, most patients in the world do not get the cancer medicines, which make a big difference in outcomes. And even worse, most of them also lack access to palliative care. This is a big problem, and really, this is not what gets on the front page of the news or generates applause and standing ovations at our cancer meeting. And I think this is something we need to spend more attention on. So I'm going to talk about a movement we've launched recently called Common Sense Oncology. And before I outline this very kind of informal network of concerned stakeholders, which we call CSO, I'm going to set the stage for why we thought this was necessary in our field. And it's largely driven by what I conceptualize as the value crisis in cancer care. The value crisis is driven by a number of domains, which we'll touch on briefly, including problematic clinical trials, an explosion of dubious primary endpoints, the small effect size of many of our new interventions, the staggering and unjustified price of many of our interventions, and fundamentally a breakdown in communication within our field, but also between oncologists and policymakers, oncologists and the public, and ultimately, I think, at the bedside between oncologist and patient. I'm not going to get into the details of some of the challenges with randomized trials. This is a piece that a number of us wrote a few years ago where they've been outlined. I think the challenges are well known, but I will make the point that I remain a staunch believer that the randomized control trial is the best way to identify new cancer therapies. And so any criticism of RCTs is not meant to be interpreted as we should abandon RCTs. In fact, I'm very alarmed at some recent trends in our field that seem to purport abandoning RCTs and just using real-world data or single-arm uncontrolled trials. And as someone who's built my career largely using observational real-world data, while there's many good things we can do with registry and population-based data, they do not and should not replace the randomized controlled trial. So any problems with clinical trials are actually self-inflicted by us as the investigators, and we should not throw out the RCT. This is the way that a simple medical oncologist conceptualizes value. I think of it as the interface between the magnitude of benefit of a new therapy and the cost. And so with any new intervention in medicine, whether it's a surgical, radiotherapy, or systemic intervention, we need to ask ourselves, what is the endpoint that was improved in the relevant trial? What was the magnitude of effect size? And do both of these things matter to patients? And I think if the answer to any of those questions is no, we should really ask ourselves why we're either studying this new innovation or why we are offering it to our patients. Just coming back to this, over the last 10 years, there's been a lot of discussion in our field about the price of cancer therapies. So we've been obsessed with the denominator, and I think we need to continue to work on that, speak out about it, especially where it's unjustified. But as individual oncologists and investigators and scientists, we actually have very little control over the denominator. Where we have total control, though, is the numerator. We are the trialists that design the next generation of RCTs. We're the investigators that put patients and consent them on trials. We're the experts that write guidelines, that recommend treatments. And we're the clinicians at the bedside that advise both policymakers for payment and reimbursement, but also advise patients. And so we in many ways own the numerator, and I think we've abdicated that responsibility, and we need to take some of that ownership back. Very briefly, a few comments about the denominator in the value construct. So we know that drug prices are skyrocketing. We now live in an era where the typical new cancer medicine costs about $200,000 per year in many countries. And if those medicines were curing patients or helping them live for many extra years, we could have a conversation about that. But the reality, as I'll show you, is the vast majority of new medicines do not improve survival at all. The second key point is that price has no bearing on the magnitude of benefit or the R&D expenditures. Our group and others have shown that. And finally, biopharma has universally pivoted to cancer care. Just a bit of data from our group to back up some of those assertions. This was a paper we published a few years ago in Lancet Oncology, where we asked a very pragmatic question. It's a question that all of us outside of our professional careers ask every day. If we need a larger house for our family, we spend more money, we get a larger house. If Dr. Palma wants to get to work more quickly on a faster bicycle, he spends more money and gets a faster bicycle. And we asked whether that relationship is upheld in cancer medicines, and we found that not only is there no association between magnitude of benefit and drug price, if anything, there's an inverse relationship whereby these drugs with the smallest benefit have the largest price tags. That's very clearly a broken system. This is a paper we published a couple of years ago where we asked, again, another very simple concept. The question was very simple. It was quite complicated for the medical students that had to go find the data. We were curious to look at the largest pharma companies in the world over the last decade and the extent to which cancer medicines represented their total sales revenues. And so we identified the 10 largest pharma companies. We went through, meaning the students, went through the financial statements for those 10 companies in each year over a decade. And really, they were looking at just a few data points. What was the total sales revenue for medicines? And of that, how much of it came from cancer medicines? And you can see in this figure, the curve in orange shows that over that decade, there was a 70% increase in sales revenue of cancer medicines. And at the same time, there was an 18% decrease in sales revenue for other cancer medicines. So you can see that the entire pharma industry has pivoted into cancer. And while on the surface, this might seem like good news for oncologists and patients with cancer, I think there's reasons to be concerned, at least two main reasons to be concerned. Number one, there are many other diseases, illnesses, and public health problems that require innovation and resources, and I don't think we should put all of our resources into oncology. And number two, there's very few, if any, circumstances in life where more and more and more money make things better. And I think some of the problems we've gotten into in our field is that there is massive financial forces at play, which have allowed us in some ways to lose the big picture for what we're trying to do. So those were just some opening comments about the denominator, which is cost in the value construct. And now I want to talk about the numerator, which is endpoints and magnitude of benefit. This is a paper from our group a couple of years ago in JAMA Oncology, and we've actually published this series of analyses over the last 15 years. We call this body of work the evolution of the randomized controlled trial in cancer. And so going back to the 1970s, in blocks of analysis, we've looked at the practice-changing RCTs of systemic therapy in breast, lung, and colorectal cancer. And this slide, I think, tells the whole story. You can see in the 1970s, 80s, and early 90s, most clinical trials were trying to help people live longer. And I would argue that the goal of any intervention in medicine should be to help people live longer lives and with better quality of life. And so overall survival and quality of life really should be the things we are trying to improve. And in fact, that was the case. But you can see in the 90s, this new kid on the block, progression-free survival, which was a construct designed to guide early phase drug development in phase 1 and phase 2, all of a sudden became used in phase 3 trials. It was never designed to be used that way. And you can see we now live in an era where almost half of RCTs, they're not designed to help people live longer. They are now designed to control tumors on a CAT scan with progression-free survival. PFS is now the king of oncology. And you can see the other striking trend here is that we now live in an era where 92% of systemic therapy RCTs are funded by the pharmaceutical industry. And this is a big problem. I am not suggesting that this should be zero. I think that many of our most impactful treatments and the best clinical trials have been studies done in partnership with the pharmaceutical industry. But I think what's happened is the pendulum has swung too far to one side, and they now control the agenda rather than being an active player in an agenda that revolves around the needs of our patients. This is a body of work from German investigators looking over 20 years, all the new cancer medicines approved by the FDA. You can see that only 31% helped patients live longer. About half of them were approved because they delayed growth of tumors on CAT scans, namely progression-free survival. So this is an essay I wrote actually as fairly junior faculty with one of my mentors, Dr. Eisenhower. And we wrote this now over 10 years ago when PFS was shifting into phase 3 trials. And at the time, it was just accepted that PFS was a reasonable surrogate. I'll show you later, I think we've learned since then, or I hope we've learned since then. And so 10 years ago, we asked the question, was progression-free survival meaningful, or was it simply measurable? I'll come back to that in a moment. This is a piece of work we just published in JNCI. And so this gets to the idea, do patients care about imaging-based control on their CAT scan in the absence of improved overall survival or quality of life? This was a multi-center study in Canada where we enrolled patients, 100 patients with the lived experience of receiving palliative chemotherapy. They were on active treatment. And they met with a research associate for about an hour to go through a hypothetical scenario in which they were offered a new cancer treatment. And the investigators explained that this new cancer treatment would not help them live any longer. It would have a series of standard side effects. It would require them to come for an infusion every week or two. But what it might do was delay the time until the tumors grew on a CAT scan. So effectively, we defined radiographic PFS without using that language. And we were interested to see how much added time of tumor control on imaging would patients want in order to accept this therapy. And we started at 24 months, 22 months, 20 months, and we wanted to see where they would flip and say it was no longer worthwhile. And what became a striking finding is that immediately, just over half of patients looked at the research associate and said they would decline the medicine regardless of any PFS benefit in the absence of improved overall survival. About a quarter of patients would take it, but they'd want tumor control for 3, 6, 9 months, not the usual 2 months that we see. And interestingly, 17% would willingly take a treatment acknowledging there was no benefit. So I think this was a striking lesson for us to see that patients do not universally value imaging control if it does not help them live longer or live better. So putting progression-free survival in context, progression-free survival may be useful if it is a surrogate for things that matter to patients, overall survival and quality of life. We've learned over the last decade that in very few circumstances is PFS a valid surrogate for OS. There are settings where it is a valid surrogate, and I'm very supportive of using PFS in that context. We've also learned that it is not a good surrogate for quality of life. Point number 2, PFS may be useful if it has intrinsic meaning to patients in the absence of helping them live longer. But again, as I've just shown you, this is far from certain, especially given the trade-offs that patients experience with side effects, their time, and the financial cost. And finally, even if number 1 or number 2 is true, in recent years, we've learned that at least some proportion of the apparent PFS improvement is likely due to artifact, forms of bias, including informative censoring. So we probably can't even believe what PFS benefits we see. So this is a famous slide from one of my mentors and teachers, Dr. Ian Tannick. What should we call an agent that increases progression-free survival, has no impact on overall survival, and adds toxicity? Unfortunately, this defines most new medicines approved by the FDA and EMA. It also defines many of the big papers in our journals and many of the plenary sessions at our conferences. And rather than celebrating these as breakthroughs, Dr. Tannick would say, and this is a controversial opinion, but one I would largely agree with, we should call these things for what they are, which is actually harmful. These are toxic medicines with side effects, and I think we need to have honest conversations within our own community and also with our patients about what they really offer. So coming back to our original essay a decade ago, we asked, is it meaningful or simply measurable? And 10 years later, we've learned that maybe it's neither meaningful or measurable. And so just by kind of serendipitous timing, just a couple of weeks ago, we published an update of the same essay where we revisited these concepts 10 years later, and the JCO published it in their Comments and Controversies series. So shifting briefly to the concept of effect size. So I think I've already explained that most new cancer therapies do not improve overall survival, but amongst those that do improve overall survival, this is the aggregate improvement. This has been seen consistently in work from our group and other groups around the world. The typical improvement in median survival is 3 months. Now, clearly there's been some transformative advances over the last decade with much larger gains in overall survival, but those are exceptions floating in a sea of some pretty mediocre cancer drugs. Now, I spend half of my time looking after patients with advanced GI cancer, so in no way do I want to take away the meaning and value of 3 extra months of life, but I think we need to bear in mind that these 3 months come with some caveats. There's lived experience of the side effects and clinical toxicity our patients experience. There's the financial toxicity to patients, families, and the health system. There is the time toxicity for what they invest in seeking this health care. And finally, there's the concept of the efficacy to effectiveness gap. Just briefly, time toxicity, this is something we started writing about a couple of years ago, and we conceptualize this as the amount of time that someone spends seeking health care. If someone is going to live for many years, or the intervention offers a large benefit, the amount of time they spend seeking treatment is probably a very reasonable trade-off and a small proportion of their overall time. However, when patients are in advanced cancer stages with 6 to 12 months left of life, we think the concept of time toxicity is really important. And I'll just paraphrase from our essay in JAMA Oncology here. Time spent pursuing cancer treatment in waiting rooms, emergency rooms, and chemotherapy units is time that cannot be spent fishing, traveling, or visiting with loved ones. This trade-off becomes most pressing near the end of life when time is short and many of our treatments offer the smallest benefits. We followed this up with actually quite a body of work exploring this from the patient perspective, but also in the context of clinical trials. And we've learned oncologists do not often discuss this, but patients want to know where and how they will spend their time, especially when time is short. And we've done some modeling and shown that for some of our approved cancer therapies in the 2nd or 3rd line setting, any added days of life may be completely offset by added days in the hospital seeking healthcare. And so we don't position that it's up to us as individual oncologists to tell patients how they should spend their time. We think that we have failed them in many ways because we have not generated the data. And so our position is Clinical trials should measure time toxicity, and clinicians should talk to patients about this burden so they can make informed choices about their own treatment decisions and how and where they want to spend their time. And just the last concept here about effect size is the idea that outcomes observed in clinical trials, what we call efficacy, are always superior to the effectiveness of therapies or what we see in the real world. And so that's because clinical trial patients are very different from patients in the real world. Doctors, nurses, and health systems are very different in the real world. And so these gains of 2 or 3 months of added life in an RCT is almost certainly attenuated in the real world and may become a number of weeks or perhaps even net neutral in some contexts. Just the last topic here before we just conclude with some thoughts about the Common Sense Oncology initiative. Again, this I think is sobering just to help us think about where we're going and where we can have the largest impact to relieve the suffering associated with cancer. I serve as a policy advisor to the World Health Organization Essential Medicine List with their Cancer Medicine Working Group. And this is a study that evolved from many of us who sit with the EML WHO committee. We call this the Desert Island Thought Experiment because, as many of you may know, the WHO has a list of essential cancer medicines that all public health systems around the world are encouraged to provide in the universal context. We were interested to see what do clinicians on the front lines of care think are the most important medicines, and are these medicines available in routine practice? We call this the Desert Island Project because it was essentially a survey, and the core question of the survey was the thought experiment many of us have played before. For example, if you were moving to a desert island and could only bring 3 books, what would those books be? And so the primary question of this survey was, imagine your government has put you in charge of cancer care. You are allowed to choose 10 cancer medicines, which will be available with no cost for all the people in your country. Which medicines would you choose to achieve the greatest improvement in patient outcome? So we ended up with about 1,000 oncologists from 80 countries. And you can see here the medicines which were most commonly put in a suitcase and taken to that desert island are generally old chemotherapy, cytotoxic, and hormone medicines. They're the drugs we know that have very large benefits. Some of our newer medicines that are quite expensive also made the list, but they're the medicines that have large benefits for patients. So you can see here the frontline clinicians are actually pretty pragmatic when you ask them what they really need to help their patients. One of the important factors to note here is most of these medicines were approved 20 or 30 years ago and therefore should be relatively inexpensive and very affordable. However, the second part of our survey showed the dire straits that most of our colleagues around the world and their patients face. Doxorubicin, an ancient drug that should be very affordable, only 1/3 of oncologists said they could provide it universally. 1/3 said they could give it, but only with significant financial toxicity. And over 1/4 of doctors said they could give this medicine, but it would cause catastrophic financial ruin for the patient and family. Likewise here for trastuzumab, now available as a biosimilar, only 15% of oncologists could provide this to all women with breast cancer. So we have a lot of work to do when it comes to ensuring that the medicines that we know have large benefits are available, let alone very expensive medicines with small or arguably trivial benefits. So a number of us have spent many years worried about these problems and did not simply want to criticize the state of things, and we wanted to be solution focused. So we came together in a planning meeting last April and formally in July launched what we've called this initiative in Common Sense Oncology, which is trying to get our systems back to outcomes that matter. And so this started with a planning meeting with oncologists, academics, and patient advocates from around the world. We held this at our university here at Queen's University in Kingston. And this was followed up by our piece in Lancet Oncology in July, which has been called the CSO Manifesto. So the Common Sense Oncology Initiative, the mission of this is to ensure that cancer care and research focuses on outcomes that matter to patients. And the vision is that we live in a world where, regardless of where patients live, they have access to the cancer treatments that make a real difference. We have a number of guiding principles. Access to quality care is a fundamental right. Patient and societal needs, rather than pharmaceutical profit, should drive research and delivery of care. Patients and public need to be involved in decisions at every aspect of treatment and policy. Survival and quality of life, overall survival and quality of life should remain the cornerstone of what we do with our treatments. There's a strong piece of health justice and equity, and then involving more than just cancer medicines. We need to remember that surgery, radiotherapy, and supportive and palliative care are also the cornerstone of high quality cancer care. We've arranged ourselves into different work streams. And so the pillars of work that we're tackling are evidence generation, evidence interpretation, and evidence communication. And so we've conceptualized that every policy decision and treatment decision is based largely on the evidence, and upstream of that is the clinical trial. So we have a project team working with clinical trials groups to ensure that they are designed, reported, and analyzed consistent with the outcomes that matter to patients. We think we have a lot of work to do when it comes to clinicians' interpretation of evidence. And so there's an educational work stream trying to foster skills in critical appraisal so that oncologists can distinguish a well-conducted trial from one that has methodologic flaws. And also so we can become critical thinkers and not just simply follow guidelines. And just because something is listed in a guideline does not necessarily mean it's the right treatment for the patient sitting in front of us. And finally, there's a work stream looking at communication. This is to improve how we communicate within our field with policymakers, with the public, and most importantly, with patients at the bedside. And so there's project teams, and this is, I should say, this movement started with a small planning committee, but it's now a very large, inclusive organization, a network of oncologists and patient advocates and academics and clinicians from around the world. We've arranged ourselves into these project teams. Patient advocates are part of every team and hold leadership roles in the initiative. And certainly, we're very keen to have others join. We have a website, which I'll show you in a moment. I'll just close by paraphrasing some sections from our CSO manifesto. Common Sense Oncology will promote interventions that measurably improve the lives of patients. We will celebrate well-conducted trials and promote effective treatments, but we will also speak up about and challenge interventions that might cause more harm than good. We will seek to decrease inequities in access to affordable, high-quality care. Improvements in the generation, interpretation, and communication of evidence will help close these gaps and move our field closer to a future in which a patient's outcome is not determined by where they live, what they can afford, or the strength of a marketing campaign. So with that, I'll close. Happy to take questions in the discussion. We have a website. We actually have a job posting right now for the first fellowship in Common Sense Oncology. So if you have any junior medical oncologists or trainees that are interested, please encourage them to apply. The deadline is actually October 15th. But thank you, Bruno, and others for inviting me today. Happy to take questions.
Chris, I have to confess I'm deeply impressed. Not only I would like to thank for this presentation you give, but even more for all the effort and the energy that you put into this project. I think this is really, I mean, the most honorable aspect you can contribute to our patients, to the lives of our patients. And I think you pointed out so clearly why and what and how. I'm, to be honest, a little bit at the loss of words. I think we really have to speak up. I'm very glad that you do it for the community, to all of us, and I hope we only learn from you and from your initiative. I would like to ask the people in the panel or also in the audience. I see that there are no really no questions, but Tom, Gabi, Beata, David, Christoph, do you have any comments to make?
Maybe I just start. No questions from my side. I just feel so impressed by all these 3 talks. This was fantastic. This was brilliant talks. So really thank you to all the 3 speakers. And I want to add to the last speaker, to Professor Bose, it's great to hear someone express what we all feel. I think that's really kind of the talk of the hour of our time. And
thank you.
Also considering.
Thank you, Bruno, for those kind comments. I think one of our key members is also joining us today, Dr. Vandergraaf, one of our sarcoma experts. I don't know anything about sarcoma anymore, but she makes sure that we also talk about common sense oncology with regards to sarcoma. So one of the amazing things about this initiative is that it's united. There is a core group of us that started the project, but we've had engagement with stakeholders literally from every country of the world: nurses, policymakers, patients, the public, academics, editors. And so I think, I think at our core, all of us care about these issues, and sometimes maybe we've lost the forest for the trees, but certainly I'm very grateful for your kind words, and this is a team effort, and we're looking for other people to join, so thank you.
Again, I would agree. Those are great talks in the sarcoma realm, at least soft tissue sarcomas. I think we cure about 20% of patients who have lung metastases. The oldest data is from resection, pretty similar to what's expected for patients with colorectal cancer who have liver metastases. Although I think in the lung or in the sarcoma world, we often resect patients who have more metastases. I have a patient who had 7 lung lesions resected and remained disease-free for as long as we followed her thereafter. Nevertheless, it means that for the 20% of patients we apparently benefit with our treatments of oligometastatic disease, about 80% we don't. And I think trying to better discriminate which patients we help is going to be key. And I think the work that Dr. Klein is doing may give us some help in that regard. And the other point, again, is in terms of defining oligometastatic disease. I wonder if a statistical definition is probably the most appropriate. Just the more metastases you have, perhaps just statistically your likelihood of remaining disease-free decreases.
Yeah, that's probably true. Those are really insightful thoughts. There's one other challenge too that I think has become evident in the past few years. And Dr. Booth, this is something to think about in terms of randomized control trial design, is that our trials are open label, right? So if we did a surgery versus no surgery trial, everybody would know what they got. If we got a radiation versus no radiation trial, everyone would know what they got. Now, that the immediate thought is, well, the placebo effect, or you're getting an intervention, is that going to make your outcomes better? But actually, there's a deeper risk than that, is that the patients who are randomized to not get surgery or not get stereotactic radiation sometimes drop out, right? And that can really compromise the trial. We did a trial not in sarcoma, but a radiation versus transoral robotic surgery trial in head and neck cancer. Some patients who were randomized to radiation went south of the border to the US to pay for their surgery because that's what they really wanted. So it's really something that I'm jealous of the medical oncologists who at least have a placebo, because then everybody goes on and is happy with what's going on. No one knows what they're getting. But for the surgeons and the radiation oncologists, we have this extra constraint, which certainly adds to our stress levels when trying to get these trials done.
Awesome. Any further comments?
So maybe I would like to add something. Thank you. Fantastic talks for both from all speakers, but I would like to comment mostly Dr. Palma and Dr. Booth. Of course, it was more philosophical talk, but what is important, we are talking about rare cancer still. So the major issue, as we know, for rare cancer is that we haven't too many data for even for randomized trials, and sometimes still the drugs are approved on phase 2 trials or single arm trials, or even we discussing the real world evidence, collection of data, etc. So it's a problem for sarcomas, which we are facing on. So because we know, for example, the story of olaratumab in sarcomas, when it was approved on phase 2 trial, when we had unexpected prolongation of OS without impact on PFS. So what was strange from the beginning, but it was approved very early, and thereafter no impact on OS and PFS in phase 3 trial. So it was immediately retracted, this drug. So and it happened, of course, because sometimes, especially FDA, approve very early the drugs, so and they think that it may have impact on practice changing. But of course, In sarcoma, sometimes we have evidence on some cases, and if it's so dramatic, so we are always thinking that it could be the new standard of care in metastatic setting, like ALK inhibitors in inflammatory myofibroblastic tumor. Nobody is discussing that it's active drug, and we have something what is changing the situation, although it was proven first on 5 cases or 6 cases, but the responses were 100%. So this is what we have for rare cancers, and in ideal world, of course, we would like to have overall survival benefit immediately in randomized trial, but this is what we cannot achieve usually in sarcomas. Even imatinib, as we remember in GIST, was approved on single arm study, but and it was unethical to do something different because the standard of care was very poor in terms of the results. So sometimes we have a very persuasive and results, but I agree that especially in metastatic setting, we need good evidence with good quality of life for patients, because sometimes, especially for adjuvant therapy, this can be the problem. When we really decrease the quality of life of the patients, and we have only the impact on relapse-free survival without any evidence on overall survival. This is really tricky in perioperative treatment. For metastatic oligometastatic disease, this is very interesting because, of course, now it's a kind of competition in lung mets, but also in other location between the surgery and stereotactic radiotherapy. And this is what is probably in our real practice sometimes discussed. Is it better to go for SBRT or not? We haven't, of course, the randomized trial. We haven't even the randomized trial to operate or not to operate the patients in metastatic setting, because we know that sometimes it's really selection bias because we operate the better patients. and they by definition they have better results, but of course this is another practice. Now I think that it's very interesting. I would like to mention this oligo-rare trial, which is now developed by EORTC, and I think that it is something for rare cancers, can prove the role of SBRT. I'm surgeon, but I think that SBRT can be very valuable in some borderline cases, or in the patient has poorer performance status, and still we believe that we can do something with local treatment. So SBRT definitely can replace sometimes surgical resection, but we need more data and how to combine this. Maybe the subscopal effect exists or not, but in immunotherapy there are more rumors about it. With classic treatment we have less. So this is, you touched a lot of unknown fields, but thank you for these lectures.
Any comments to Piotr's?
No, I mean, I would agree that I treat colon cancer and pancreas cancer, so there's lots of patients, and I agree that the rare cancers pose challenges, and I probably presented an overly simplistic approach to this, but I do think that we've allowed the system to create some of these problems. So rather than 10 institutions all running their single-arm phase 2 trial of a drug with modest effect, I think instead we need to renew support and collaboration through our major cooperative trials groups, because we actually can run RCTs on these rare cancers. It's just whether there's the political will to do it. I mean, there was an RCT in the US of adrenocorticoid cancer once upon a time. So I do acknowledge it becomes more challenging with rare cancers. I also acknowledge that every once in a while, there'll be a therapy that is so effective, BEP for testes cancer, imatinib, where maybe we don't need to randomize, but those are pretty exceptional. And so I think that there are exceptions to the rule, but I think a properly designed RCT powered to improve overall survival, and maybe we have preliminary approval based on a PFS endpoint, but the trial's been powered for OS as well. And there's preliminary approval while we wait for the data to mature, because I think, you know, the mantra that patients want cancer treatment faster, I would argue patients want good cancer treatment faster. And there's risks with rushing, and we expose people to toxic treatments that actually cause harm. So, but I agree that there are subtleties here where a large phase 3 RCT with overall survival might not be the most appropriate course.
Okay, well, thanks so much. I would like to thank every presenter for the talks. I think we all could learn from each of you. You made a huge contribution. And I think we have to learn from this webinar that we should question more intensely what we do every day in the treatment of our patients. And in this respect, I'm convinced that we can improve patient care for the future. Thank you so much.